But if you're deliberate, if you're authentic, if you're engaging people in a process where they can see and you can be transparent about what you're trying to accomplish, people generally trust that.
Welcome to Natural Collisions, brought to you by COAG Detroit. Conversations about the challenges and opportunities in the nonprofit sector, highlighting the voices and nonprofit work in Detroit and Southeast Michigan, and beyond. I'm your host, Sharnae Sanders, Program Manager at COAG Detroit. Today's Natural Collision conversation is centered on participatory grantmaking. Foundations are evolving, expanding to move many decisions from the boards within funding organizations to putting the decision-making process in the hands of the community being most affected. This nurtures ownership, empowerment, respect, and positive change. Colliders for this conversation are all a huge part of the participatory grant-making efforts in Michigan and nationwide. Our guests this month are Rishi Madgill.
Great. Thank you. Glad to be here. I'm Rishi Madgill. I'm with Shift Detroit, most recently with Greenlight Fund Detroit. I'm here in Detroit for a long time working on a number of programs and initiatives to build economic mobility and prosperity and opportunities for our residents here in the city. And so glad to join all of you to talk about this topic.
Leah Wisty.
Great. Hi, my name is Leah Wisty, and I'm the Executive Director of Michigan Interfaith Power and Light. And we work with people of faith and conscience for a stable climate and a cleaner, healthier, more just world.
Brian P. Hogle.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Brian Hogle. I'm a Senior Program Manager with the Kresge Foundation's Detroit program. Been with the foundation about 10 years now. My work is primarily focused on community development in Detroit and really improving quality of life in Detroit's neighborhoods.
And Lauren Boone.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren Boone. I'm a grants manager at COAG Detroit. What I do is I get to fund not all of them, but a good majority of the great work that's happening on the ground in Detroit and throughout Southeast Michigan.
Let's jump right in. This conversation on participatory grantmaking starts with a discussion of the traditional models of funding versus newer participatory grantmaking efforts. What is participatory grantmaking, and what's the difference?
Maybe I'll start off by saying I think every foundation has its own model of decision making. So, one foundation is one foundation, but I think broadly, at least looking at funders that I know in Detroit, the traditional model is that the board approves at least some portion of a foundation's grants. And so there's tends to be really a focus on, as grant-making staff, program officers, and others are thinking about the grants that they're making, they have their board in mind. What am I going to need in order to get my board support, board approval in order to make these grants? So I think at least historically, traditionally, foundation grant making has been really focused on the trustees, the board members as kind of the approvers of grants. And so, of course, depending on the demographics of your board, that can set up an organization to be focusing on, a different set of folks than the communities that might be impacted by the grant making. And really kind of tailoring the process and the thinking to the board and less to communities. And I think over the last many years, there has been a push to become more focused in decision-making processes on the community itself, on residents, on other stakeholders, and finding ways to get them involved in the process of figuring out how different foundations' grant resources are allocated.
Yeah, I would jump in and say too, especially being in Detroit, we've had a number of efforts that reach back, years and decades to bring decision-making and power into the hands of people that are working in the community and can make decisions for the communities that they're in. And so a great example is several years ago, a number of folks came together to get 12 recommendations for Detroit funders on how to better create more avenues like participatory grant making, so that maybe projects, initiatives, priorities that are traditionally funded but are then poor can get better funded and exposure and opportunities. So that's one of, I think, a number of things that communities and individuals have led to say, let us, be a part of this process. We deserve to not only have a voice, but to have a direct hand in where dollars and priorities are set. And so even in our city over the last several years, there's been a number of efforts just locally and different models. Obviously, we're going to talk about a couple here that have now created different avenues for non-traditional folks, if you will, in the history of philanthropy to more directly give dollars back to the community.
Thank you. And I would love kind of like a follow-up if we can unpack this a little bit more. Like, how has participatory grant making worked in actual practice? And how is this process equitable, like in terms of who's making the decisions? Like, Rishi, can you talk or take us through like the story of Greenlight Fund? And Brian and Lauren, like maybe you could talk a little bit more about the story of KIPD Plus.
Yeah, certainly. I'll pass it to Lauren first to maybe talk about KIPD, and then I'll flip back.
Brian, do you want to start with the history, and then I can jump in?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So the KIPD initiative, Kresge Innovative Projects Detroit, acronym is KIPD. The Kresge Foundation's Detroit program started in 2014 with the idea of really wanting to provide grant resources for projects in neighborhoods around the city, really wanting to center communities' vision and their priorities for what they wanted to see happen in the neighborhoods and provide grant resources for their projects. And I think there's been a lot of evolution over time. It was initially entirely held within the Kresge Foundation's Detroit team, and over time have kind of expanded out and had additional partners in Michigan Community Resources and then COAC Detroit help us to make it actually more community-centered. And I think COAC has done an amazing job of helping us, I think, really move it toward more of a participatory grant-making model, where before it was all foundation staff making decisions, trying to get a lot of input on what communities wanted to do, but foundation staff ultimately making the decision, to a model where it is much more resident-driven in the way that the resources are allocated to projects around the city. And I'll pass it off to Lauren to share more.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So like Brian was sharing, we were brought on by Kresge and also program partner Michigan Community Resources based on the experience that we had already kind of activating some grant programs that use the participatory grant making model. So we were excited to bring our experience from those programs to KIPD Plus. One of the main things we did to make sure that the program was a little bit more community-centered was to really take a look at the selection committee and who was making the decisions for the grants ultimately. So when we first started, we were brought on in 2021. We chose to have a 50% resident selection committee. In the next year, we actually bumped that up to 75%. So there are even more residents really making those decisions on who was receiving the grants. And we thought this was important because, of course, like those are the folks that are going to be benefiting from the programs themselves. So they should be the ones making the decisions. They're the ones who knows what's happening in their community and what they want to see in their community. So instead of having it be a top-down approach or a decision made by someone who's more removed from the community, having those residents share their opinion and make those decisions are really helpful and important. So that was one thing that we did. Another thing is we're looking at the program as a whole. So we're really excited that for the next round, we brought together an advisory group that's also majority resident. We also have some past grantees, a peer participatory grant maker from outside of Michigan, who are all coming together to take a look at what we've done in the past, what's working, what's not, and how we will work to make the program more equitable. Is all things that they're tackling, and they've been digging in and being very honest and giving us a lot of work to do and things to consider. So those are just a couple of the things that we've done so far.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. Lauren mentioned a few things that are really priorities and have been priorities of the different streams of work that were done over the last several years on our end, really one of the key focus areas was really putting the power in the hands of people who are affected by our grant decisions. And so that includes being very deliberate about demographics, race, having multiple audiences, inputs, having different levels of power, people with far own power, people who don't have maybe positions in the community where they can enact things through institutions. So we wanted to get multiple viewpoints. And so that was really key in terms of bringing different folks to the table. And then in terms of participatory process, the way we set up our process, it was to include folks as decision makers at every stage. So from the start, identifying the issues that we want to focus on, to understanding the local landscape, all the way up to selecting where the dollars would go, and then partnering the grantees so that we could partner effectively and ensure that they succeeded. And so I think part of that, the success that we see, if you will, what is success? Well, the people who are defining the success should be the ones that are also kind of the ones working with the programs and benefiting from the programs as well. So that's all been kind of wrapped up in sort of the philosophy and the mindset that we had here in Detroit with our grant making process. And so we set up specific selection bodies, again, that had both formal roles and stakes in the community, everywhere from business to nonprofits to block clubs, but then also residents directly from different neighborhoods who might be impacted by our grant decisions. And as we went through our process of selecting where dollars would flow to, those bodies would identify other arenas, other folks who weren't already involved in the process to pull in. So I think a key part of our participatory process was to keep it iterative. Once we started honing in on certain focus areas, bringing in the practitioners that are already doing that work to get their feedback, right? Looking at national best practices, interviewing and discussing with kind of the macro context of what's happening, not only locally, but elsewhere, to get that into our process. Looking at data and research, specifically by both folks on the ground, as well as broader studies by Kresge and other folks. So there's really a big container, right, of doing, this participatory process of getting a lot of these inputs and then coming to a consensus, so that once we are giving dollars out, it's not just a financial transaction. It's something where multiple parties are invested in the success of what we're trying to do in a community.
So one of the things that this makes me think of, so my organization, Michigan IPL, is a KIPD grantee, and we also have our own, what we call a carbon fund. So it's a small pool of dollars that we re-grant to congregations or organizations who don't have a lot of resources. Maybe the members of their congregation are low income or low wealth, or they're from, a historically marginalized group. And what we see, and I think I've seen this reflected in KIPD's granting process as well, is there is both the, hey, let's put some decision-making power in the hands of the community that might benefit from these dollars. That's something we're not doing with our carbon fund, but I think we should be at my organization. But then also on the front end, building support throughout the whole arc of the process, right? Because this has been a barrier for us in wanting to re-grant these carbon fund dollars to communities so they can, make some kind of green improvement to their building, their space, is that they don't exactly know where to begin, and they need support on the front end, even to be poised to access the dollars that are there. So just thinking about the whole cycle and how the participation can really benefit community in all parts of that cycle.
I think that's a really good point. Something that Michigan Community Resources, our other KIPD partner, and COACT have done a really good job of, is trying to think more holistically. I think it's easy to get focused on just like, what is the set of grants that we're going to make this year through this initiative, but really thinking about from folks having an idea, supporting them to develop a strong application that they can submit to the initiative, but then hopefully they can also use it with other funders, whether it's philanthropic funders or public sector funders, whatever the case might be. And then on the back end, for folks that aren't funded, how do we help connect you to other resources as well, so that it's not overly focused on our process and our initiative, but thinking about how can we partner with community organizations to help them access as many resources as possible, both through the KIPD Plus initiative, but also through all the other sources that are out there.
Kresge Innovative Projects Detroit Plus, also known as KIPD Plus, is an initiative to support nonprofits seeking to transform neighborhoods in Detroit, Highland Park, and Hamtramck with projects that reflect resident priorities. The participatory grant-making effort is in partnership between the Kresge Foundation, Michigan Community Resources, and COAC Detroit. Michigan Interfaith Power and Light is a grantee of the KIPD Plus program. Executive Director Leah Wisty shares the experience of applying and being selected within this participatory grant-making modeled fund. And all our guests share insight about how this process works.
Yeah, so I think we were selected for the grant more than a year ago. So I'm delving into the depths of my memory on this one. But what I remember is that, the application process was very straightforward. You go to the portal, you see all the questions. The questions are, not meant to confuse or anything like that. They're all very straightforward, right? People can answer them fairly easily. I think there was also an option to, if we felt like we wanted to do a video submission, we could do that, these kinds of things. And then there were checkpoints with the supporting staff along the way. If we had questions, there was an office hours, there was a person to contact. So it was clear there was a lot of intentionality going into making the process doable, right? For people who perhaps don't have a lot of experience getting foundation grants.
Yeah, and I can jump into about a concrete example that I think wouldn't have happened if we hadn't truly leaned into our participatory process. And so during the COVID era, which we're still in somewhat, but when it was really hitting, and obviously we had a lot of priorities that were on top of mind. But right before COVID hit, there was a reading law that was passed in the state of Michigan that, essentially created a barrier to progress to fourth grade for third graders. And so there was, a lot of disproportionate effects of that law onto Detroit families and kids. And so while there was a lot of priorities, of course, that we had to tackle during COVID in that sort of era, then right before that hit, one of the things we found through our resident engagement as we spoke with parents and folks in the communities was how they felt they weren't a part of the learning process for their children, and that they wanted to be empowered, they wanted to be at the table, they wanted to be able to take more control of that specific third grade up to third grade reading. So, of course, we have so many great literacy and other types of programs in Detroit that existed. But if it wasn't for that group of residents in our process to say, no, you need to really take a look at including us, we indeed did that. And through sort of that landscape analysis, through talking to more folks, we're able to find that, yeah, it's true that there isn't really a robust program that deliberately engages teachers, parents, and children together so they can develop literacy and reading habits at home. So that was a really specific thing that came out of our participatory process. And we looked for providers that could then do that work. We found one, Springboard Collaborative, that's now in Detroit. And because we brought that in, because of what our parents and residents are saying, this is what we want, it quickly had roots in the city, and we were able to bring that to, several thousand households and children, when otherwise we probably would have taken a different route in terms of how we spend our dollars.
I think another example, Leah was speaking about the application. So we were very intentional when COAC was brought on about kind of tweaking it to be as clear as possible to make sure any application questions really matched what the selection committee would be reviewing on. And if you remember, I said earlier that the selection committee was a majority resident. So they were the ones scoring along with some other stakeholders. Depending on the year, if they were residents or not. We also have program staff that are scoring as well. But where the participatory process and the importance of having residents, I think, really shines is that we actually have a convening where folks get together and discuss kind of the applicants that rise to the top and receive the high scores, there's an opportunity for folks to share out about someone who didn't make the list. So I think Leah brought up grant writing somewhere, but so not everyone has a grant writer. We are aware of that. So the folks who are reviewing, having this opportunity to kind of share like, hey, we know of this organization, or I reviewed this application. They're really engaged with the community. That was evident in their application. Maybe their writing wasn't perfect, their grammar wasn't perfect, but we want to lift this up and we want them to be considered by the full group is really important. Without residents there, I don't know that those applications would be lifted up, and some of those applications go on to be awarded grants. So that's just another example that I think really shows how having residents and the participatory grant-making framework is really important.
Have you found, Lauren, that people who have been residents who have been a part of your grant-making committee, making decisions about what to fund, what to not, have they themselves then become kind of future applicants? Has that been part of that virtuous cycle?
I can't say that I can think of anyone off the top of my head. I know there are definitely leaders of nonprofits who are on the committee. I'm not sure if they then go on to say like, hey, we should go and apply for this grant. I will say that evaluation is also a really important part of KIPT Plus. So we're always taking a look at what has been done, if it's working well, like looking at the numbers and analyzing it. We have a program partner that are driven Detroit who's doing that. So that's actually a good question. I would be curious to know the answer to that.
I think we have had folks on that are participating on the review committee that have either received KIPT grants in the past or applied to KIPT in the past, so that they have kind of the experience with the process. And I think that's helpful too, in that they kind of know where there are places things work well or maybe they don't work so well, and they kind of can push us and ask questions. And I think kind of have that even internal feedback loop within the review process. And as Lauren mentioned, it comes into the committee discussions as well.
Yeah, I'd concur. I mean, one of the benefits of doing this type of process is not just the obvious grant making and I think sort of what I was hearing in that question are what are the other benefits of people being able to build power and make, take action in their communities. And that was one set of feedback that I've received from folks that just, have said, we're just simply not invited to these tables, especially with philanthropy, let alone given the tools or the access really to do this sort of work. And so I have seen that beyond, the specific grant making that we've made, folks have been able to take those relationships, those access points, right, those tools of engagement into other domains. And so, the process in itself is beneficial to kind of seed more work, further work. Some folks who are our residents on our process were involved directly in where the grants and the programs ended up. Others end up taking some of those opportunities and building other things in their communities. So that was really, I think, some other positive benefits of going through this process.
Participatory grant-making relies on participation from funders, other stakeholders, and most importantly, the community. This collaboration is necessary to guide the application criteria and process, to identify who makes up the selection committee, and to center the entire programmatic approach around the voice of the people who will be affected. Our guests discuss innovative approaches for collaboration as well as best practices.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I mean, there's a couple of movements, if you will, that kind of crisscross. We've talked here specifically around, grant making specific projects and ideas. There's also been, a number of initiatives around cash transfers or gifts to organizations with no strings attached. And so there's a number of movements that can intersect and that we can learn from and pull different levers of this grant making process. And all of them, I think, have some benefits. All of them, require probably some more thought and thinking, especially when you localize it to the community that they're in. But those are just a few of the other things that I've seen that I think are promising and should be looked at in intersection with sort of this participatory process. One of the things that our processes have shown is it's been able to kind of deconstruct some false narratives. The example I gave before, there were a lot of folks unfortunately thought that one of the challenges in our community around literacy were parents weren't involved. And when we went to parents, what we heard was like, we're not invited to be involved, right? So we were able to deconstruct something that, hadn't taken the time and effort to really get to. The same thing around participatory. There might be a fear from funders, oh, if we let go of the power and the decision-making that we have, then maybe, the best decisions won't be made, right? And it's actually the opposite. What through my experience has been is when you do that, effectively, you're getting better outcomes, which is something that funders and donors and everyone want to see, because people are truly involved. They're finding topics that are of interest and important to them, and there's direct and embeddedness into ensuring the programs and the dollars are used in the way that are needed. So I think that's just one of the first steps, is to realize that actually you might accelerate some of your goals rather than thinking that this might be a detour from how you traditionally do your grant making.
And I think, there's another step here that Lauren mentioned of kind of the program staff of COACT, Kresge, MCR have created this structure for, what are the criteria, what are the grant sizes, what are the types of grants we're going to make, and even bringing in now an advisory committee to giving them the power to say, no, we don't want to do it that way. It needs to be done in a different way. We should structure it like this. We should allocate the resources according to these criteria, not the ones that you all came up with. And so I think really just kind of like making a series of steps that increasingly moves power and decision-making, allocation of resources toward the community. I think it can feel overwhelming or may be hard to get buy-in for a kind of a wholesale change, but it is possible to take steps over time in that direction. And, ideally we'd be able to just flip a switch and move over to a more holistic participatory grant-making approach. But I think there's also ways to do it incrementally to get buy-in and get support, help leadership understand too that this is something where we can still deliver on our strategies. We can still have the impact that we want to have, but we can do it in a way that's more consistent with kind of values of equity and inclusion as well.
Brian, is this something that Kresge is doing outside of its Kresge in Detroit program?
Yeah, I would say I think we're definitely, our team, our Detroit program within Kresge is learning a lot from the KIPD Plus initiative in the process. And I think we're doing making some changes in other parts of our programmatic work, but still largely it's kind of a program staff-driven model of grant making. But I think we take a lot of learnings from the KIPD Plus initiative as we think about how do we get input from the community, how do we invite community into helping us develop our strategies. I think a lot of resonance with what Rishi has shared about their approach to grant making, trying to move in that direction. And I think we have a number of program teams within the foundation. You see a lot of experimentation in different ways of kind of engaging with grantee partners as well as community members and initiatives and strategy development. So I think it's something where we felt very much we're in process and on a learning curve, and try to share what we're learning within the organization and with others as well.
I asked our guests if they had any final thoughts on participatory grant making, the benefits, and the challenges ahead.
Closing this conversation out, maybe just a final thought on this is the community participation piece just strikes me as one way to really put into practice the values that a lot of organizations are now finding themselves, I think, like required to profess around justice and equity, right? Like it's been fashionable in recent years to put out statements about what do we think about justice and equity, and that's cool when it's genuine, but this is one way that it can really be put into practice, right? I think these statements kind of hopefully get us on a path towards thinking about how do we institutionalize those values, but this is really one way of putting that into practice, right? walking the talk. So I think it's really positive to see such good examples of that happening right here in the city of Detroit.
All right. Final thought. I think I've been really just super pleased with our partnership with COACT and the way that the KIPT Plus initiative has evolved toward participatory grant making. And I feel like for philanthropy as a foundation, as a sector, we're just kind of scratching the surface. I think that there is a lot more learning for us to do, a lot more change for us to make. And I'm sure on the outside, kind of the progress seems slow, but I'm encouraged that we're moving in this direction because it's the right direction for us to be moving.
People are generally pleased. Obviously, there's frustration from folks who are not receiving grants. A couple of people have applied multiple times and not received any funding. People who are receiving funding are also seeing the changes. And I think that bottom line, everyone, whether they're frustrated or whether they're excited that they're receiving the grant, are appreciative that the changes are being made and understand that the process has to be slow. Obviously, everyone wants it to be quicker. I think even the partners would be happy if we could snap our fingers and just have it be this perfect process, but that's obviously not the case. But yeah, I'm just always really encouraged by how understanding everyone is. A lot of the things that we're funding sometimes are things that need immediate response. And even with that, people are still willing to be gracious and really understand that we're trying our best to make the program work for everyone and be responsive to needs in a way that gets at what community needs.
Certainly. Well, we're in the business of serving the community. So to do our jobs effectively, we need the real expertise of folks from our community and the residents that are going to be working with the grant dollars that we have. So a lot of the things we've talked about, collective voice, having true choice, being proximate to the issues, the people, the folks that have been doing this work for a long time, all that only improves the work that we're trying to do. And, by definition, when you democratize a process, when you have multiple voices, you're not going to get everything that you want, whether you're the one with the dollars and the power or whether you're the community with the ideas. But if you're deliberate, if you're authentic, if you're engaging people in a process where they can see and you can be transparent about what you're trying to accomplish, people generally trust that and they generally end up making good decisions collectively. And I think that's what we want to do.
Thank you to all of our guests. Leah Wisty, Executive Director of Michigan Interfaith Power and Light. Learn more at miipl.org. Rishi Maudgill of Shift Detroit and former Executive Director of Greenlight Fund Detroit. Learn about the Greenlight Fund at greenlightfund.org. Brian P. Hogo, Senior Program Manager at the Kresge Foundation. Learn more at kresge.org. And also Lauren Boone, Grants Program Manager at COACT Detroit. This has been the Natural Collisions Podcast from COACT Detroit. Remember, the word COACT itself means to work together, because we know we cannot have transformational impact if we only work alone.